This story takes place during the summer after my junior year of college, when I was 21 years old. Enough time has passed that I can finally share what happened without my hands shaking as I type. I had just finished a grueling semester and was looking forward to a relaxing break before my senior year. My roommate Emma had invited me and our two other close friends, Maya and Jessica, to spend a long weekend at her grandmother's beach cottage. The place had been in Emma's family for 3 generations, and she described it as the perfect escape from our stressful college lives. Emma's grandmother lived in a retirement community now and rarely used the cottage, so she was thrilled to let us stay there. The house sat on a quiet stretch of coastline, far enough from the main beach towns to feel secluded, but close enough to civilization that we would not be completely isolated. When we arrived on that Thursday evening in late June, I understood why Emma loved this place so much. The cottage was charming in that weathered, salt air way that only coastal homes can achieve. White clapboard siding, blue shutters, and a wraparound porch that faced the ocean. Inside, everything felt frozen in time, with nautical decorations and family photos covering every surface. We settled into our rooms quickly. Emma took her usual childhood bedroom, while Maya and Jessica shared the guest room with twin beds. I chose the small sunroom that had been converted into a bedroom, mainly because I loved the windows that looked out over the dunes toward the water. The first 2 days were exactly what we needed. We spent our time reading on the beach, playing card games on the porch, and cooking simple meals together. Emma proved to be an excellent host, sharing stories about her childhood summers and pointing out all her favorite spots along the shoreline. On Saturday night, we decided to have a bonfire on the beach. Emma knew where her grandmother kept the firewood, and we gathered driftwood to supplement our supply. As the sun set, we built a respectable fire and settled around it with blankets and the bottle of wine Maya had brought. The conversation flowed easily as we caught up on everything that had happened during the semester. Maya talked about her internship plans, Jessica shared updates about her long-distance relationship, and Emma told us about her family's upcoming reunion. I mostly listened, content to watch the flames dance and listen to the gentle sound of waves hitting the shore. Around 10 o'clock, we noticed lights moving along the water's edge in the distance. At first, it looked like someone walking with a flashlight, but as the lights got closer, we realized it was actually two people carrying what appeared to be lanterns. They were walking slowly, stopping occasionally to examine something on the sand. Emma called out a friendly hello when they got within earshot, and they waved back. As they approached our fire, we could see they were two men, probably in their 30s, wearing casual beach clothes. The taller one introduced himself as David, and his companion was called Ryan. They explained that they were staying at a rental house, about a mile down the beach, and had been collecting sea glass by lantern light. David showed us a small bag filled with smooth, frosted pieces in various shades of green and blue. They seemed nice enough, and when David mentioned they had a cooler full of beer back at their place, Maya immediately perked up. Our wine was nearly finished, and the idea of continuing the evening sounded appealing to most of us. I was getting tired, though, and something about the situation made me feel slightly uncomfortable. I could not put my finger on what it was exactly. Maybe it was the way Ryan kept staring at Jessica, or how David seemed overly interested in learning details about where we were staying and how long we would be there. When the group decided to walk to the men's rental house, I begged off, claiming I had a headache and needed to get some sleep. Emma looked concerned and offered to stay with me, but I insisted she go and have fun. I promised I would be fine on my own and that I would leave the porch light on for them. I watched the 5 of them disappear into the darkness, their voices and laughter gradually fading until I could only hear the ocean. I cleaned up around the dying fire, made sure the cottage was locked up properly, and headed to bed. I fell asleep easily, but woke up around 2 in the morning with an uneasy feeling in my stomach. The cottage was completely quiet, and when I checked the other bedrooms, I found them empty. My friends had not returned yet. I tried to go back to sleep, telling myself they were probably just having a good time and had lost track of time. But by 3 o'clock, I was genuinely worried. I tried calling Emma's phone, but it went straight to voicemail. Maya and Jessica's phones did the same thing. I paced around the cottage, looking out the windows toward the beach and checking my phone every few minutes. At 3:30, I decided to walk down to the shore to see if I could spot them coming back. The beach was empty and eerily quiet except for the constant sound of waves. That was when I heard Emma screaming my name from somewhere in the distance. The sound sent ice through my veins. I ran toward the voice, stumbling over the uneven sand in the darkness. I could hear Emma calling for help, and her voice sounded absolutely terrified. I found her about halfway between the cottage and where the men's house was supposed to be. She was running toward me, sobbing and barely coherent. Her clothes were torn, and she had sand in her hair. She grabbed my arms and tried to explain what had happened, but she was crying so hard that I could barely understand her. The only words I could make out clearly were Maya and Jessica, and help them. I managed to get Emma back to the cottage and convinced her to call the police while I tried to piece together what had happened. Through her tears, she told me that the men's rental house had been dark and empty when they arrived. David and Ryan had insisted they knew of another place to get drinks, and they had led the girls further down the beach. Emma said something had felt wrong from the beginning, but she had not wanted to seem paranoid. When they reached a small beach house that was clearly abandoned, David had suddenly become aggressive and demanding. Ryan had grabbed Jessica, and when Maya tried to intervene, David had shoved her to the ground. Emma had managed to break away during the chaos and run back toward our cottage, but she was terrified about what might be happening to Maya and Jessica. She kept saying she should have listened to her instincts and never left the bonfire. The police arrived within 15 minutes, which felt like hours. Emma gave them a description of the men and explained where she thought the abandoned house was located. The officers immediately called for backup and requested a search helicopter. I stayed with Emma while the police began their search. She was in shock, alternating between crying and sitting in complete silence. I made her tea and tried to keep her calm, but I was struggling with my own fear and guilt about not going with them. At around 5 in the morning, one of the officers came back to update us. They had found Maya and Jessica at the abandoned house, and both were being taken to the hospital. The men had been arrested. The officer would not give us details about the girls' condition, but he assured us they were alive and receiving medical attention. Emma and I drove to the hospital, where we spent the next several hours waiting for news. Maya had a concussion and several bruises, but was otherwise physically okay. Jessica had been more seriously hurt and needed to stay in the hospital for observation, but the doctors said she would recover fully. The police told us later that David and Ryan were not their real names, and they had been using the abandoned beach house as a base for targeting young women who were vacationing alone or in small groups. They had been doing this for months, and Maya, Jessica, and Emma were not their first victims. Both men were eventually sentenced to lengthy prison terms, but the legal process took almost 2 years to complete. During that time, none of us really talked about what had happened that night. We all dealt with it in our own ways, but the friendship between the four of us was never quite the same. I finished college and moved to a different state for my first job. Emma transferred to a school closer to home. Maya and Jessica both struggled with anxiety and depression for years afterward. We stayed in touch through social media, but we never planned another group trip together. The hardest part for me was the guilt. I kept thinking about how different things might have been if I had not let them go off with those men. I replayed that night over and over, wondering if I could have prevented what happened by speaking up about my uncomfortable feelings or insisting that we all stay together. It took me a long time to realize that what happened was not my fault, and it was not Emma's fault either. The only people responsible were the two men who made the choice to hurt my friends. But understanding that, intellectually and feeling it emotionally, are two very different things. I still think about that summer sometimes, especially when I hear about similar crimes in the news. I think about how quickly a fun, innocent evening can turn into a nightmare, and how important it is to trust your instincts when something feels wrong. Emma eventually moved back to her hometown and became a social worker. She told me once that she wanted to help other people who had experienced trauma, and that working with survivors gave her a sense of purpose. Maya became a lawyer and has worked on several cases involving violence against women. Jessica moved across the country and rarely speaks about what happened, which I completely understand. As for me, I learned to be more careful about the situations I put myself in. But I also learned not to let fear control my life. I still go to beaches, though I am more cautious about talking to strangers. I still travel with friends, though I pay more attention to my surroundings and trust my gut feelings. The cottage still belongs to Emma's grandmother, but none of us have ever gone back there. Emma told me recently that her grandmother is thinking about selling it, and I think that might be for the best. Some places hold too many difficult memories to ever feel peaceful again. I wish I could say that time has healed all the wounds from that night, but that would not be entirely true. What I can say is that we all survived, and we all found ways to build meaningful lives despite what happened to us. Sometimes that has to be enough. My friend Danny inherited his aunt's beach cottage in Cape May after she passed last spring. The place had been sitting empty for months, and Danny figured it was time to put it to good use before deciding whether to sell it or keep it in the family. The cottage was nothing fancy, but it had character. Built in the 1940s, it sat on a quiet stretch of beach about a mile from the main tourist area. Danny had fond memories of visiting his aunt there as a kid, though he admitted he had not been back in nearly 10 years. When he called me in August and asked if I wanted to spend a long weekend there, I jumped at the chance. Work had been grinding me down, and the idea of a few days by the ocean sounded perfect. Danny and I had been friends since college, and we both needed a break from the city. We drove down on a Thursday afternoon, planning to stay through Sunday. The cottage was smaller than I'd expected, just 2 bedrooms upstairs and a living area downstairs that opened onto a screened porch facing the water. The whole place had that slightly neglected feel of a house that had been closed up too long. Danny showed me around, pointing out where his aunt used to keep her art supplies and the corner where she would sit every morning with her coffee, watching the sunrise. There was something peaceful about the place, even with its creaky floors and the way the wind made the windows rattle. That first evening, we walked the beach and grabbed dinner at a seafood place in town. The restaurant was busy with summer crowds, but the cottage felt wonderfully isolated when we got back. We sat on the porch with a couple of beers, listening to the waves and talking about nothing important. The next morning, I woke up early and decided to take a walk along the water before Danny got up. The beach was nearly empty except for a few joggers and someone walking their dog in the distance. I must have been out there for an hour, just enjoying the quiet. When I got back to the cottage, Danny was in the kitchen making coffee. He looked tired, like he had not slept well. When I asked about it, he shrugged and said he thought he had heard footsteps on the porch during the night, but figured it was probably just the wind moving something around. We spent most of that day on the beach, swimming and reading. Danny brought a football, and we tossed it around for a while like we were kids again. The weather was perfect, not too hot, with a steady breeze off the water. That evening, we decided to cook instead of going out. Danny had brought steaks and vegetables, and we grilled on the small barbecue on the back deck. As the sun started to set, we moved back to the screened porch to eat. It was during dinner that I first noticed them. 2 figures walking slowly along the beach in front of the cottage. They were too far away to make out clearly, but something about the way they moved caught my attention. They seemed to be walking unusually slowly, almost deliberately. Danny followed my gaze and saw them too. They appeared to be a man and a woman, both wearing dark clothes. What struck me as odd was that they stopped directly in front of our cottage and seemed to be looking up at us on the porch. After a minute or two, they continued walking and disappeared around a bend in the beach. Danny and I exchanged looks, but neither of us said anything. It was probably nothing, just other people enjoying an evening walk. The same thing happened the next night. We were sitting on the porch after dinner when the 2 figures appeared again, walking from the same direction at almost exactly the same time. Again, they stopped in front of the cottage and appeared to be watching us before moving on. This time, Danny stood up and waved, thinking they might be neighbors being friendly. But the figures did not wave back or acknowledge us in any way. They just stood there for what felt like several minutes before continuing their walk. Danny tried to laugh it off, saying maybe they were curious about who was staying in his aunt's place. But I could tell he was starting to feel uneasy about it, and so was I. There was something unsettling about being watched like that. On Saturday night, Danny suggested we go into town for dinner and maybe find a bar with live music. I think we both wanted to get away from the cottage for a while, though neither of us said so directly. We had a good time in town, staying out later than we had the previous nights. It was almost midnight when we got back to the cottage. The porch light was on just as we had left it, and everything looked normal. But when we walked up to the front door, Danny stopped suddenly. He pointed to the porch decking and asked me if I saw what he was seeing. There, clearly visible in the dust and sand that had blown onto the porch, were footprints. The prints were definitely not ours. They were smaller, and they led from the steps to the windows of the living room, then around the corner of the porch toward the back of the house. Someone had been walking around the cottage, looking in the windows. Danny immediately pulled out his phone and called the police. While we waited for them to arrive, we checked all the doors and windows to make sure nothing had been broken or disturbed. Everything seemed secure, but the footprints were undeniable evidence that someone had been on our property. The police arrived about 20 minutes later. 2 officers looked around the cottage and took pictures of the footprints. They asked us about the people we had seen walking on the beach, and we described the 2 figures as best we could. One of the officers said they had received a few calls recently about people acting suspiciously in the area, looking into windows and walking around properties at night. He suggested we keep all the doors and windows locked and call immediately if we saw anyone on the property again. After the police left, Danny and I sat in the living room with all the lights on, trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to pack up and drive back to the city right then, but Danny felt like we should not let a couple of strangers ruin our weekend. We decided to stay, but we made sure every door and window was locked tight. Danny found a baseball bat in a closet that had belonged to his aunt, and we kept it nearby. Neither of us slept much that night, jumping at every sound the old cottage made. The next morning, Danny went outside to check around the property while I made coffee. When he came back in, his face was pale. He told me to come outside and see what he had found. Behind the cottage, pressed into the soft sand near the back deck, were more footprints. But these were different. They formed a complete circle around the cottage, as if someone had walked all the way around the building multiple times during the night. What made it even more disturbing was that there were 2 sets of prints, side by side, moving in perfect synchronization. The 2 figures had been circling our cottage while we slept inside. We packed up immediately and left that morning, cutting our trip short by a day. Danny called the police again to report what we had found, and they said they would increase patrols in the area. During the drive back to the city, Danny was quiet for most of the trip. Finally, he told me something that made my blood run cold. He said his aunt had mentioned in one of their last conversations before she passed that she sometimes felt like she was being watched at the cottage. She had told him about seeing the same 2 people walking on the beach night after night, always stopping to look at her house. She had called the police several times, but they never found anything, and eventually she stopped calling. Danny said his aunt had started keeping all the curtains drawn and rarely went out on the porch in the evenings during her final months there. He had thought it was just the isolation getting to her, maybe some mild paranoia that comes with age. Now he was not so sure. Danny has not been back to the cottage since that weekend. He is still trying to decide whether to sell it, but he admits the thought of going back there alone makes him nervous. He has asked me a few times if I would go with him to clear out his aunt's belongings, but I have not been able to bring myself to say yes. Sometimes I wonder if those 2 figures are still out there, walking the beach every night, circling the empty cottage, and waiting for someone new to watch. The thought keeps me awake sometimes, and I find myself checking the locks on my own doors more often than I used to. Danny received a call last month from a neighbor who lives about a quarter mile down the beach from his aunt's cottage. The neighbor said he had been seeing lights in the windows of the cottage at night, even though he knew it was supposed to be empty. When Danny asked the police to check on the property, they found no signs of forced entry, but they did find something that made us both deeply uncomfortable. In the sand around the cottage, there were fresh footprints circling the building, just like the ones we had found that weekend. The police told Danny that whoever was doing this had probably been watching the cottage for years, maybe even decades. They suggested he consider selling the property as soon as possible. Danny is planning to list the cottage next month, but he has not told potential buyers about the watchers. I keep thinking he should, but I understand why he has not. Who would want to buy a place that comes with its own stalkers? I drive past Cape May sometimes on my way to visit family further south, and I always wonder if they are still out there. 2 figures walking slowly along the beach, looking for the next house to circle, the next family to watch. The cottage sits empty now, waiting for a new owner who does not know about the footprints in the sand or the 2 figures who walk the beach at night. I hope whoever buys it will be luckier than Danny's aunt, luckier than we were. But something tells me the watchers will be waiting for them too. This all happened last August, during what should have been one of the best weeks of my summer. I had just finished my first year of graduate school, and my parents thought I deserved a break before diving into my thesis research. They surprised me with a week at a beach rental in the Outer Banks of North Carolina. The house belonged to a family friend who had offered it to us at a discount. It was one of those classic coastal homes, built on stilts with weathered cedar shingles and a wraparound porch that faced the ocean. During peak season, it would normally rent for thousands of dollars a week. But since it was late August and most families were preparing for back-to-school season, we got it for almost nothing. I should mention that I have always been someone who enjoys solitude. While most people my age were spending their summer breaks at crowded beaches or music festivals, I was genuinely excited about having an entire week to myself. No roommates, no family obligations, just me and the sound of the waves. The drive down from Virginia took about 4 hours. I arrived on a Sunday afternoon when the August heat was just starting to break. The house was exactly as advertised in the rental photos, maybe even more beautiful in person. The interior was decorated in that classic beach house style, with whitewashed furniture and nautical touches throughout. I spent the first few days exactly as I had planned. I woke up early to watch the sunrise from the deck, spent hours reading on the beach, and cooked simple meals while listening to the ocean through the open windows. It was peaceful in a way that I had not experienced in months. The house felt like a sanctuary. During the day, it was filled with natural light and ocean breezes. The only sounds were the rhythmic crash of waves and the occasional call of seagulls. I found myself sleeping better than I had in years. It was Thursday night when things started to feel different. I had spent the day walking along the shore, collecting shells and taking photographs. By evening, I was pleasantly tired and looking forward to another early bedtime. I made myself a simple dinner of pasta and salad, then settled onto the couch with a book. That was when I first noticed the sound. It was subtle at first, like footsteps on the wooden deck above me. The house had 3 levels, and I had been staying primarily on the middle floor where the main living areas were located. The top floor had 2 additional bedrooms that I had barely explored. I paused my reading and listened. The sound came again, definitely footsteps, slow and deliberate. My first thought was that maybe the house was settling, or that the wind was moving something around up there. Old beach houses make all kinds of noises, especially at night when the temperature drops. But the sounds continued, and they had a pattern that was distinctly human. Step, pause, step, pause. Like someone was walking very carefully, trying not to make noise. My heart started beating faster, but I tried to stay rational. Maybe it was an animal that had somehow gotten inside, or perhaps the previous renters had left something behind that was now shifting around. I decided to investigate. I climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, my bare feet silent on the wooden steps. The hallway up there was dark, lit only by moonlight filtering through a small window at the end. There were 2 bedroom doors, both closed, exactly as I had left them when I first toured the house. I opened the first door and flicked on the light. The room was empty, furnished with twin beds and a small dresser. Everything looked undisturbed. The second room was identical, also empty and untouched. I checked the windows, which were all locked from the inside. I even looked in the closets, feeling somewhat foolish as I did so. Finding nothing, I returned downstairs and tried to convince myself that I had imagined the whole thing. I finished my chapter and went to bed around 10 o'clock, choosing the master bedroom on the 2nd floor, as I had every night since arriving. I fell asleep quickly but woke up sometime in the middle of the night. The room was completely dark, and it took me a moment to remember where I was. Then I heard it again. Footsteps, but this time they were directly above me, and what I now realized was the 3rd floor bedroom that sat right over the master suite. The steps were slow and measured, pacing back and forth across the room. Back and forth, back and forth, like someone was walking the length of the bedroom repeatedly. I lay in bed, my body tense, listening to the rhythm. It went on for what felt like 20 minutes before finally stopping. I did not sleep well for the rest of the night. Every small sound seemed amplified. The house creaked and settled around me, and I found myself straining to hear any sign that the footsteps had returned. When morning came, I was exhausted and on edge. I tried to rationalize what I had heard. Maybe it was the house responding to temperature changes, or perhaps there was some kind of plumbing issue that was causing the floors to shift. I spent the morning researching old house noises online, looking for any explanation that made sense. But deep down, I knew what I had heard. Those were human footsteps, and someone had been in the house with me. The next night, Friday, I decided to stay awake and listen. I positioned myself on the couch in the living room where I could hear sounds from both floors above me. I kept all the lights off and sat in the darkness, waiting. Around midnight, the footsteps started again. This time, I was ready. I grabbed the flashlight I had placed beside me and quietly made my way up to the third floor. The walking sounds were coming from the room at the end of the hall, the same room I had checked thoroughly the night before. I stood outside the door, my hand shaking as I reached for the handle. The footsteps stopped abruptly, as if whoever was inside had heard me approaching. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sounds had been. I turned the handle slowly and pushed the door open, shining my flashlight into the room. At first, everything looked exactly as it had before. Empty beds, empty dresser, nothing out of place. But then, my light swept across the far corner of the room, and I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a small pile of food wrappers and empty water bottles on the floor beside the window. Someone had been eating meals in this room, hiding here while I went about my daily routine downstairs. The window above the pile was slightly open, and I realized with horror that this was how they had been getting in and out. I backed out of the room immediately and ran downstairs to call the police. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely dial the numbers. When the dispatcher answered, I tried to explain the situation as calmly as possible, but my voice was clearly strained. The police arrived within 15 minutes, which felt like hours. 2 officers came to the door, and I explained what I had discovered. They took my statement seriously and immediately went upstairs to investigate. They found the same evidence I had seen, plus a few additional items I had missed in my panic. There was a dirty blanket hidden in the closet and what appeared to be a makeshift bed made from folded towels. Someone had definitely been living in that room, probably for several days. The officers explained that this was not uncommon in rental properties, especially during peak season, when housing was expensive and scarce. Transient individuals sometimes broke into vacant homes and stayed hidden during the day, only moving around at night when they thought the house was empty. They searched the entire property but found no sign of the intruder. The person had likely heard me moving around and escaped through the third-floor window, which opened onto a section of roof that connected to a large oak tree. From there, it would have been easy to climb down and disappear into the night. The police filed a report and advised me to keep all windows locked and to contact them immediately if I heard anything else. They also suggested that I might want to find alternative accommodations for the remainder of my stay, but I was determined not to let this experience ruin my vacation. I spent the rest of the night awake, checking and rechecking every lock in the house. I moved a chair in front of the door to the third floor and made sure my phone was fully charged and within reach. When morning came, I felt drained but relieved that the ordeal seemed to be over. The remaining 2 days of my vacation passed without incident, but the peaceful atmosphere I had enjoyed was completely gone. Every sound made me jump, and I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder. I cut my stay short by one day and drove home early, eager to be back in familiar surroundings. I never found out who had been staying in the house or what their story was. The rental company was apologetic and refunded part of my payment, but they seemed to treat the incident as an unfortunate but not entirely unusual occurrence. They installed additional security measures and promised to inspect the property more thoroughly between bookings. Looking back on the experience, I realized how lucky I was that nothing worse happened. The person hiding in the house had gone to great lengths to avoid confrontation, but there was no guarantee that the situation would have remained peaceful if I had encountered them directly. The thought of what might have happened if I had chosen to sleep in one of the third-floor bedrooms still gives me chills. I have not stayed in a beach rental since then, and I am not sure I ever will again. The idea of being alone in an unfamiliar house, especially one with multiple floors and plenty of places to hide, no longer holds any appeal for me. Some experiences change you, and this was definitely one of them. The house itself was beautiful, and under different circumstances, it would have been the perfect vacation retreat. But sometimes the most peaceful-looking places harbor the most unsettling secrets. I learned that week that you never truly know who might be sharing your space, even when you think you are completely alone.